Hello and welcome to another version of our Flight Operations podcast. My name is Casey Meeks, Technical Standards Captain, joined today with Chris Dillon and Ben Dwyer. What are you guys talking about today?
Well, Casey, we're talking about the new temp-rev revision that's coming out to Vol 2 due to engine ignition faults that we're having on the NEO aircraft and specifically to the LEAP 1A engines. Chris, can you give us a little background on what has caused this TR and why we've come with a TR and a supplemental procedure compared to other procedures that we have?
Absolutely, Ben. Over the last 6 to 8 months, we've noticed an intermittent issue being developed when we've done automatic engine starts that have resulted in engine 1 or 2 ignition A or B faults. We have followed up with Airbus, and Airbus has identified this as a systemic intermittent issue across the LEAP engine fleet.
So with that, Chris, in this procedure, it looks like a pretty detailed step-by-step procedure. Did we work with Airbus to ensure that, or did we just come up with this procedure ourselves working with maintenance and the other departments?
No, we actually took a very in-depth step-by-step process to get this certified. We actually conversed with Airbus, both over over in Europe as well as over here, worked with multiple engineers at Airbus to determine the best way to design this procedure. We submitted one attempt at this. Airbus came back and said, actually, this is a really good idea. We have no operational objective to you guys submitting this. Added a few more edits, but then worked to get this approval process going.
All right, so can you walk me through kind of what a crew can expect and when they would use this procedure? I'll interject here and there asking some questions, but can you just give a little reason of where and when the crew will see and know to use this procedure?
Absolutely. I'll walk you through a normal engine start with this nuisance that we're actually seeing. Again, first off, I want to start with this is not a consistent problem. Even if you incur this one time, the next 3 times that airplane flies, it may never see it again. It's very intermittent. But what happens is, let's say that we're starting an engine using the automatic start process. The first attempt, of course, a full engine start attempt is 3 attempts in that engine start. The first attempt, let's say it's using ignition A. Once the fuel flow is added and you're using ignition A, if there is no light off, the engine will abort the start, dry motor for 45 seconds. In that time, you're going to get an ECAM, engine 1 start fault, with the blue to do of new start in progress. In that case, we just essentially, as we always like to say, sit on our hands and let the FADEC take over. After 45 seconds, it's going to turn on the igniter again, ignition A, which we started with the first place, at which point then it's going to add the fuel. If it does not indicate a light off again, at that point it's going to abort the start again by cutting off the fuel, turning off the ignition. Your now ECAM after this second one is going to turn to engine 1 or 2 start fault, ignition A fault, new start in progress with that blue to do. Again, sit on your hands, let that FADEC overtake the start, and it's going to attempt a third start. In this case, it's going to start with both igniters and an increased fuel schedule. What we've seen in this nuisance problem is on this third start, because of the increased fuel scheduling, the engine lights off.
So this procedure is then going to be used after that. Is that correct? Because there's an ECAM that still is latched, and we can't obviously, even though the engine started, we can't continue with the flight with an ECAM being
Displayed. Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Ben. That is kind of the problem. So if it lit off on the second time, when I had said you had the engine 1 start fault, new start in progress, if the engine lights off at that point, ECAM goes away just like we see in the sim every other day. Off we go. The problem is once it goes to that third attempt, the FADEC has considered, okay, well, I tried ignition A twice. The engine didn't light off, so I must have an ignition problem. So I'm going to latch that ignition A fault even if the engine lights off because it used both igniters. In this intermittent problem, though, Airbus has identified, again, this is a cross-NEO fleet problem. They've identified it. It's actually not an ignition problem. It's a fuel scheduling problem. So if you go back into my explanation of the engine start, in start attempts 1 and 2, it's the same fuel scheduling. On the third attempt, it's going to add the second igniter, but it also ups the fuel scheduling to its max fuel flow. That's what truly causes the light off, more fuel. They've identified after constant troubleshooting of this issue that there's never been a fault found with these igniters. They actually determined that this was a fuel scheduling problem.
So if I understand this correctly, Chris, This is a software issue, not an igniter issue, but there's a couple things here. Is if it starts off on the second start attempt, obviously the ECAM will go away. No reason to use this supplemental procedure. If it starts on the third automatic start, then this is when we would reference this procedure. Can you clarify and just make sure that if it does not start on the third attempt, would we use this procedure, or would we now contact maintenance control?
No, and that's one thing we really wanted to make sure we clarified in this procedure. Read it very carefully and understand exactly what it's saying. This is only a solution if it does in fact start on the third attempt, because again, this is identified then as the fuel scheduling problem. If it doesn't light off on the third attempt, we then have to bring maintenance in and identify what truly is going on. It may be associated with this, but if the engine does not start light off on that third attempt, and the engine is you get the ECAM at the end of that third attempt to turn the engine master to off, you do need to return to the gate to so that maintenance can apply some troubleshooting tasks.
Alrighty, I think I got that and understand the process. Let's walk through this procedure just to make sure that it's pretty clear. We've did the auto start. It started on the third sequence of the first start. We have the ECAM. Now, since that ECAM is displayed, we will shut the engine down and try a restart. Is that correct?
Yes. What we want to do now is identify that it truly is the ignition A fault. Essentially consider this another type of system reset. It's just like it's in the QRH miscellaneous system resets or the troubleshooting manual out of maintenance. We've coordinated with Airbus to identify this as a system reset for the engine on a known ignition nuisance.
Alrighty, and so now we're getting ready to start the engine again. It has some wording in here and some instructions about pulling circuit breakers for each different ignition system type. Can you walk through that a little bit?
Absolutely. So again, going back to the ignition start, when you do one attempt, the first attempt it's going to use, like I used in my previous example, igniter A. If we went back and just shut the engine down, waited 60 seconds for the engine cool down, and then started the engine again, we would actually be using igniter B. So we've never actually identified that igniter A is in fact working. So what we need to do is we shut it down, we pull this circuit breaker, which is taking ignition B offline momentarily, just specifically in this example, to make sure that the engine uses the A igniter in the next attempted start to identify that it is not in fact an an ignition A fault that's faulted.
Okay, so the crews are going to really have to pay attention to what ECAM is displayed to ensure that they're pulling the correct circuit breaker for the system that wasn't displayed on the ECAM. Is that correct? So if ECAM is engine 1, ignition B fault, they'll be wanting to pull the circuit breaker for ignition A so that we know that ignition B is being used on this next start and showing that it's not an ignition fault. It was just this anomaly of the fuel scheduling in that aspect. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And that's why if you look at the supplemental, we've split up the procedures specifically so if you have an ignition B fault, you go to this procedure, or an ignition A fault, you go to this procedure. We didn't intermix and say if, and, or but. If you're in a NEO, and I want to stress that this is only a NEO-affected engine, you go directly to that fault that you had and follow that procedure from top to bottom.
Alrighty, and once the engine starts and the ECAMs are gone, what is our next steps? Do we need to call maintenance control? Do we need to write something in the logbook? I see logbook entry accomplished here, but can you walk us through that and what the importance of this logbook entry is?
Excellent question. Back to what we were saying about the coordination of what this procedure is a quote-unquote system reset. We want the logbook entry accomplishment so that maintenance can go and track the record of history on this ignition fault problem. All it is again, follow the example that we have in the supplemental, and you can also reference Vol 1 for system resets. You'll just enter the successful engine start as directed by the supplemental procedure due to the engine ignition fault, sign it, and that's all you have to do for that to close that system reset entry out. There's no requirement to contact maintenance because they're going to be tracking this as they go back on the history of the logbook.
Alrighty. A lot of great information here, and it sounds great, and that we've got a procedure to help us keep, our operation moving and stuff. But what is the time frame? Is there a fix in place? Has Airbus come with a solution or any of that, or a time frame until this issue gets fixed?
There is a solution coming. Unfortunately, we have a problem prior to this problem to get fixed. Right now, we're waiting for what's a FADEC upgrade called FCS 6.0. This is going to help with those engine temperature tolerances on start that we've been having, where you may have seen the engine hot start or hung start issues due to that spallation in the high pressure turbine. So now that they're going to fix that one, which should be released any day now, we're now going to be unfortunately waiting till probably, I'm anticipating, mid next year to get FCS 7.0. That is the next upgrade to the FADEC system, again in 2020 sometime. That will increase the fuel scheduling across the entire engine start. So starting off on the first attempt, you're going to have the max fuel scheduling, as Airbus has identified this truly as a fuel scheduling issue.
Alrighty. So are we the only ones that have this procedure? Is maintenance control aware of this? And another question is how are we going to know if an airplane's been updated with that? Are we using the crew briefing item section, or what's our plan there?
So what we're going to do, we have coordinated with maintenance on this. They are aware that we have our procedure. Then, of course, provided if you actually do step through this and you find out that the engine doesn't light off, or you get the doesn't light off at all, or in that second attempt, you get the ECAM again and you return to the gate. They have their own troubleshooting tasks, but they are aware that we have our procedure to assist in continuing when you get this nuisance issue. It is really easy to forget what's in the supplemental section. We always have those kind of funny procedures. This is one I anticipate we use quite often. We do have this across our fleet. This is a pretty substantial LEAP issue that we know is a nuisance issue that we're excited to get fixed. But to help remind crews that this isn't in there besides this podcast, we're also going to be putting a crew briefing item on every flight plan release of a NEO engine, just to remind you, hey, if you do have the engine 1 or 2 ignition fault during an engine start, reference a supplemental procedure.
Well, thanks, Chris. I think you explained pretty detailed and the reason behind this procedure and the fixes coming up. Greatly appreciate your time, Casey, and the functionality of this podcast, what we believe to be a very successful and beneficial tool. So thanks all, and thank you, Chris and Casey.
Thank you. Thank you.